today's episode, we talk about the Renters Reform Bill disaster, the chaos in the courts, and a common practice by councils which is causing havoc, with our special guest, lawyer and landlord, Ian Narbeth. So before we get started talking about the Renters Reform Bill and sort of everything going on in the private rented sector at the moment, I just want to go back in time a little bit. And can you just kind of briefly explain to us how you became a lawyer and how you became a landlord as well?
Right. How I became a lawyer was, for some reason, from the age of about 12, I wanted to go into the law. I don't know why I had that idea, probably watching things like Crown Court on television, which will be known to some of your older viewers, but not the younger ones. And then I sort of aimed for that and read law at university. However, I didn't end up as a barrister, but as a solicitor, and I did my articles at a big city firm, Norton Rose. I ended up doing property because I had my best experience in that department. In those days, and this is 40 years ago, it was rather unstructured training, so it was pot luck whether you were sitting with somebody who gave you interesting work and was a good manager or not. But fortunately, the property partner I worked with was very good. So that's how I ended up as a property lawyer. When we bought our third house, in fact, we had a spare attic, and we rented that out. It had its own separate entrance, a spiral staircase to the back of the house. We rented that out, and that helped to pay the mortgage and give us a bit of income for a number of years. My wife's family had also invested in property for many, many years, and when her parents died, we inherited some property, which was a very nice start. And then in 2012, my daughter had just graduated, and we were looking for something for her to do, and went to the franchise show in London and came across Platinum Property Partners, who help landlords who want to invest in houses in multiple occupation, HMOs. But as I said to Clara, that was the most expensive afternoon I ever had, because we had to sign up and pay a fee to join. But we've never regretted it. I think without that, we would not have got into HMOs, and also would not have had the knowledge and the wherewithal to run them effectively and legally. A lot of people think HMOs are just an easy way to make lots of money. They're not. They're very management intensive, and thankfully my daughter runs them, and pretty well runs on her own now, with a little bit of guidance from me every now and again. But so that's my background and how I came to be able to be a landlord.
No, that's really interesting to hear sort of how you became a landlord and how you entered your legal career. That's really interesting to hear as well. And now I want to pick your legal brain if I can. So, I mean, sort of regarding the Renters Reform Bill, I mean, we've had the bill recently passed it recently passed the House of Commons stage, and now it's heading to the Lords. And I mean, this bill, I mean, is just causing huge, huge uncertainty. I mean, what impact do you think the Renters Reform Bill will have on the rental market? And I mean, secondly, as well, do you think a lot of landlords will actually end up selling up because of this legislation?
Right. Well, I think it's already had some adverse consequences, because landlords have been anticipating it and very worried about what was going to happen and what life will be like after the Renters Reform Bill is brought in. The biggest thing which landlords worry about is the abolition of Section 21, so-called no-fault evictions, where you don't have to give a reason. In practice, if tenants knew it, they can frustrate most of them, because it's so complex now, and there's so many pitfalls to doing a Section 21 that many landlords will fail and will get to the door of the court and then find they've missed something out and get caught out. But it's had the effect psychologically on tenants of, well, I don't have a defence to this, so I might as well prepare to go, and they go. And that worked, and it was sort of effective. The problem which we've had, and which I think Parliament recognises, that there's a massive backlog in dealing with cases. And, it's one thing to get the tenant out after, say, 2 months, which is what shelters say they have to do, but that's never the case. It's 2 months for the notice, and then if the tenant doesn't go, you've then got to apply to get a court date, and that could be 6 to 8 months ahead. And then if they don't go after the court order, it could be another 6 to 8 weeks before you can get a bailiff in. So you're looking at, 9 months to a year, sometimes a lot longer, to get a tenant out if the tenant's determined to stay. So although this has been a bit of a thing that landlords were sort of, so concerned about, in practice, it's not going to be any more difficult to get tenants out using other grounds, Section 8 for rent arrears or for antisocial behaviour. Most landlords don't want to get tenants out for no good reason, but there are a few, and they're the ones that we hear about, and they're the ones that go off to people like Shelter and the Citizens' Advice and complain, and in some cases justly, that the landlord has just capriciously served a notice. Perhaps the tenant's complained about something in the property and the landlord doesn't want to fix it, or the landlord just wants to get an increase in rent, and so just throws the tenant out. I'm afraid it's that small minority of landlords who behave badly that cause the problems, and that's why we're getting this legislation. But also, there are a lot more people now who are renting than ever there were in the past. I mean, I bought my first house when I was 25. My daughters are both older than that, and they could not afford to buy their house to live in at the moment, and nor could many people's families, unless they're very wealthy and mum and dad can help them, or they are in a very high-powered job where they've got a massive income. So life is difficult. There are far more renters now, and they make a lot of noise, and the politicians have been listening to them.
Exactly. And I mean, you were saying as well, yeah, of course, Section 21 is one of the biggest sort of talking points in the bill. And I mean, we've had the government now say, well, they aren't going to abolish Section 21 until the courts are ready. And I mean, as you were touching on there, like possession cases are taking months and months and months. And, it's causing huge frustration for landlords because it's costing a huge fortune in the meantime. And I mean, we've sort of like industry bodies like Property Mark that are calling for a specialist housing court to deal with possession cases. I mean, what's your opinion on that? And I mean, how do you think the government should reform the court system? I mean, I know that's a very big
Yes, if I
question,
could wave
but
my magic wand, I would sort it. They need more judges, and they probably need more courts now, because a lot of the courts are falling down, or they've got asbestos, or they can't be used, and so on. So that's a big problem. Honestly, if we have to wait until the courts are reformed, then it will never be brought in. And unfortunately, that's not going to happen, because it's almost certain we're going to have a Labour government. Or even if we had a Labour as the largest party, they will be in coalition with people like the Greens, or they will just get the votes of the Greens and the Liberal Democrats to bring in the legislation. So the abolition of Section 21 is coming, and landlords need to realise that. Labour are not going to hold off doing that. And in fact, paradoxically, and I've spoken to people like Ben Beadle and David Smith, who's a very well-known housing lawyer, if the Tories get this bill passed before the election, then it's done, and Labour will leave it alone. If they don't, then just think what Labour might do. They will embellish it. They will add bells and whistles, which will not be landlord-friendly to it, and it'll be a worse bill than it is already. And that's my big fear. So, I mean, a number of the Tory MPs and peers have sort of woken up rather too late in the day to the problems this is bringing, and they're sort of fighting a rearguard action to delay it. But this business about, well, until the courts are reformed, we won't do it, isn't going to work, and they should get on and make the best of a bad job. And it is a bad job, but it's been promised by the Tories, and they better deliver it. I think Michael Gove thought that he would get votes from renters. I don't think we'll get a single net extra vote from renters as a result of this bill, because A, because they've taken too long to bring it in, and B, because tenants are finding that their rents are going up and there's a shortage of housing, and a lot of more landlords are asking for home-owning guarantors now, which is difficult for many tenants to provide. So the Tories have got the worst of all worlds. They've got a bill that really they shouldn't have been promoting, and it's not winning them any votes, and it's going to do harm to both landlords and, I'm afraid, tenants.
No, exactly, yeah, and I mean, as you were saying there at the beginning, if only we could just wave a magic wand and make everything better for the courts. But I mean, you've said previously that abolishing Section 21 will just help nuisance tenants avoid eviction. I mean, what's your advice for landlords? I mean, how to deal with problem tenants?
Yeah, I mean that is a big problem. In fact, we had earlier this year a tenant who caused serious problems. I won't go into details. I don't want to identify the tenant, but we served a Section 21 notice, and the tenant left pretty well after the 2 months. So we were relieved that that had happened, but that doesn't always happen. Um, yeah, antisocial behaviour is a big problem, and landlords are sort of in the firing line to try and sort it out. And I think we're also going to talk a bit about selective licensing, which is brought in. And one of the reasons for having selective licensing in an area is to deal, well, originally it was to deal with low housing demand, which I suspect doesn't really exist in, it won't go anywhere in the country. And secondly, to deal with antisocial behaviour. But landlords are having virtually the only tool they've got taken away, because if you have to go to court to get the tenant out and to prove antisocial behaviour, then you're going to need to give evidence. And who's going to give evidence? Well, it's the person who's on the receiving end of the antisocial behaviour. The neighbour who's very frightened because the tenant is abusive or throws stuff over their garden fence or puts stuff through the letterbox, and this is generally unpleasant and threatening. Can you expect a tenant like that to go to court to give evidence, to wait possibly 6 to 9 months, and then hope that the antisocial tenant next door will be evicted? No, it just isn't going to happen. You know, not many people will put themselves through that. And paradoxically, if the person on the receiving end of the antisocial behaviour is the tenant, they are likely to have to move to get out of a nasty situation, or they just have to shut up and lump it and stay next door to the antisocial person. And the MPs have not thought this through at all. Now, they've introduced what they say is something to make it easier to evict for antisocial behaviour. And it's a tiny, tiny change, so that now, instead of the conduct being likely to cause nuisance or annoyance, it has to be capable of causing nuisance or annoyance. But the thing is, first of all, there aren't many cases because most landlords have used Section 21, so we don't know how it gets to court. But I can't imagine that people are going to be arguing about the subtle difference between likely to and capable of. By the time it gets to court, it will be actual antisocial behaviour, not capable of being antisocial. It'll be antisocial. If the tenant isn't going to say, oh, well, I think it might become bad at some time in the future, and the landlord says, just all right, well, I'll try and get the tenant out because it might be capable of being antisocial. That isn't going to happen. So we're back then to the problem of who is going to give the evidence against the antisocial person. And I just don't see that happen. So that is going to be a major problem. How do landlords deal with that? A partial solution, I'm not sure it'll always work, is to get a guarantor of the tenant. And then at least you've got somebody you can go to and you can say, look, your friend Fred is causing all these problems. You know, can you have a word with them or get them to leave? But, you know, Fred's guarantor may not be in the mood for doing that, or Fred's guarantor may be as nasty a guy as Fred is, and nothing will happen. So I fear this is going to be a problem, and I fear that the weak and the vulnerable neighbours and other tenants who are affected are going to be the ones who suffer. And the Parliament doesn't seem to have thought about this at all.
No, definitely. I agree with that as well. Yeah, antisocial behaviour, I think, is a massive, massive sort of problem that I don't think the government have actually really looked at properly. We could spend ages talking about the Renters Reform Bill, but if I move on now, one of the topics I really wanted to talk to you about is the stay put instructions by local authorities, which I mean is causing huge, huge chaos. in the private rented sector. And I mean, for those that don't know, it's common practice for councils to tell tenants to remain in their home when facing eviction, even though it goes against basically all the rules. I mean, for example, in the Homelessness Code of Guidance, it literally says that housing authorities should not consider it reasonable for an applicant to remain in occupation until eviction by a bailiff. But we've had councils just doing the exact opposite of this guidance. And we've recently had Jacob Young, the housing minister, saying that instructions by councils to stay put are completely unacceptable. So, I mean, just why do councils tell tenants to stay put when facing eviction?
Because they are hoping that they don't have to rehouse these tenants and that something will turn up. And they just, are swamped already. They're having to pay for a lot of bed and breakfast and the short-term accommodation. And also a lot of landlords are now not willing to rent to councils to house tenants because, they end up with the worst tenants going into those properties. I saw the report about the minister saying that it's, quotes, unacceptable, but there's no stick behind that. It's just, well, the council is encouraged to not to wait, tell people to wait, but if they do say that, or effectively they say, well, if you go before you have to, then we're not going to rehouse you. Nothing will happen, and it's a shame that it's taken years for the ministers even to realise that this has been going on. But I mean, we've had over a dozen housing ministers under this Tory government, so it's a revolving door. By the time they've got their foot under the table and they know where their photocopier is, they're out doing another job. So I really don't know how they are going to solve this. And the courts, there's no real sanction. I mean, if the courts sort of said, well, if you don't go, then you will be evicted immediately, and if it's willful disobedience, then you'll go to jail, or you'll be fined. But that doesn't happen. So the problem for a landlord, of course, is often he's there with a tenant not paying the rent, and he is, what's known as an involuntary creditor. So every day that goes by, he is owed more money, and the longer this goes on, the bigger the debt. And then the prospects of recovering the money from a tenant, who may well just disappear, and it's not always easy to find them or trace them. Okay, you can get a private detective, but then if somebody owes you £10,000 and they're earning 15,000 a year, well, the chances of getting that money back anytime soon are pretty slim. So yes, it is a big problem. Parliament needs to have some sanction against councils, but I don't see that happening.
No, as you say, yeah, we've had a revolving door of housing ministers, and it only just seems now that they've just realised that this is actually a huge, huge problem. And
Mm.
I mean, what do you think that the government need to actually do to help landlords stay in the sector? What would you like to see?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I mean, it's sort of pie in the sky because it's not going to happen. As I said, this renters reform bill is going to come in. There doesn't seem to be any sort of slacking off and giving landlords a bit of a break. It seems to be all stick and very little carrot. And the more, the tenant lobby groups, particularly people like Shelter and maybe the CAB and some others, the Generation Rent, don't seem to realise that what they are often asking for makes things worse overall. Now, I'm always very careful. I'm critical of Shelter, but not, for doing the job which they do for people who really desperately need it. And that you need to have a housing charity to help people who are living in very substandard accommodation, who've got an abusive landlord and so on. So I don't have a problem with that. But they tend to lump all landlords in to the same boat, and they don't discriminate. And they don't sort of say, well, actually, this tenant really is undeserving. They've messed the property up. They aren't paying the rent that they could do. We're not going to support them. But they do support them. And then, there are now so many obstacles in landlords' way to getting the property back that it discourages them. I don't see the government doing much to change that situation. But I just wanted to mention one thing which in the Renters Reform Bill, which has been slipped in, and I looked at it again this morning, and you wouldn't know it unless you look up the cross references, which is that at the moment your Section 21 notice will fail if you have not protected the deposit and served the prescribed information form in a timely manner at the start of the tenancy. At the moment, that does not apply to Section 8 applications. But when the Reform Bill is brought in, that will apply to all evictions, except for antisocial behaviour, or the tenant is guilty of nuisance or annoyance or using the property for an illegal or immoral purpose. So this is slipped in, and it will make it harder for landlords to get problem tenants out. And unless the landlords are properly advised, and I would suggest that they go to a specialist or instruct a solicitor to help them, they will get to the court 6 months hence, and then the tenant or somebody from Tenants Information will say, oh, by the way, you were 2 days late serving the prescribed information form 2 years ago, and the judge has to throw it out. And that's going to be a big problem. So saying that they're making it easier for landlords to evict tenants is not the whole story. That is making it harder. And I don't know why that's been slipped in. It's a nasty little trap for landlords.
No, that's really interesting to hear, actually. As you said, yeah, it's a little sort of snippet in there and a trap, as you say, I think, as well. And I mean, sort of my last question, I know it's all kind of seeming doom and gloom in the private rented sector at the moment. And I was going to ask, I mean, what do you think of the future of the private rented sector? I mean, do you think there's even going to be a future at all?
I think there will be more professional landlords. I mean, I'm staying in it because I can keep up just about with the legislation. And for our buy-to-lets, we have good managing agents who vet the tenants, and touch wood, we don't have too many problems. For the HMOs, you know, I am concerned. I mean, if you think about antisocial behaviour, if you've got people living under the same roof, you know, behaviour which is going to be problematic is not going to be antisocial in the legal sense. You know, it's the chap who's constantly untidy, who borrows other people's food and milk from the fridge, who leaves their stuff around, who has unsuitable people there, who, you know, has noisy parties and that sort of thing. You just aren't going to be able to get them out on antisocial grounds. So that may be a problem. We will just try to vet the tenants much more carefully, but it does mean that you'll be very discriminating. So anybody who's got any sort of criminal record or come from a problem situation, no, well, we can't touch them. I mean, we had a council approach us recently, wanted to house somebody, and they were quite open about all the history of this person. Excuse me. And, you know, a very sad life story, but I can't risk it. I certainly can't risk it if I can't use Section 21 to get them out promptly. So I'm afraid that, you know, the landlords are going to be much more selective about the tenants they take. And paradoxically, of course, because some landlords sell up, or, you know, they may have a property which they don't need to rent out, you know, it's useful income, they don't need it. So the tenants are finding there's a shortage of properties. Landlords are much more demanding of, you know, they want guarantors, and the rents go up, as we've seen. You know, now my costs have gone up as well, so I'm not making any more money because I'm having to pay more on utility bills and all the rest of it. But that is, I'm afraid, the situation we're in at the moment.
Yeah, exactly. And as you say, you know, it's not just, you know, costs going up for tenants, but also like for landlords too, as you just said.
Yeah, I mean, we've had a period of low interest rates, and that may have seduced many landlords in to make, you know, improvident purchases where, you know, they're getting a 4 to 5% return on their capital. And if you're borrowing money at the, you know, to 2.8%, then that's okay. If suddenly it goes up to 4.5%, 5% or even more, then all of a sudden you're losing money every month or breaking even. But then as soon as you've got any extra costs, that's coming out of your pocket. And for a lot of landlords, they were looking for, you know, for a pension and an income from property, and they may find that it isn't such a good investment as they thought. But that said, capital values are sort of holding up, though I think they've come down a little bit. I don't see them crashing just because there's too many people chasing the existing housing stock, and we're not building enough houses every year to to cope with the demand.
Yeah, exactly. Like the supply and demand at the moment, is just so, so bad. But I'm going to have to end it there, I'm afraid, Ian. But it was absolutely great chatting to you. And thank you so much for letting me pick your legal brain today. Really
Thank
appreciate
you.
it.
Okay.
Thank you.